Despite the development hell it got stuck in, Dead Island 2 released to a pretty moderate success with fans. And now that all the post-launch content has been exhausted and we won't be getting anything new for the game, people are looking towards what comes next for Dead Island. And I imagine that what comes next would be Dead Island 3, so I thought today we'd think about 5 things that would be must-haves or improvements for Dead Island 3. Now the first one for me is actually pretty easy. I want a much better variety of weapons. I do like Dead Island 2's weapons for sure. They're great to attack with, they all feel really satisfying and you can make some cool combinations, but I felt like at times I was using the same weapon reskinned. I also felt that while the combinations were cool, very few of them actually were really fleshed out and you could do a ton with. They all pretty much felt like, here's a machete, you can put shock or flames on it or extra melee damage. I never felt like I was actually combining multiple things to make a really cool unique weapon, so I would definitely want that expanded upon. One weapon that did have this though actually came in the DLC and it was like a baseball bat with a chainsaw blade attached. I thought that was really cool. And that's the exact type of crafting I want in a game, where I'm actually combining two weapons together, not just adding a little lightning mod to a standard weapon. But on top of that, I also want some new and unique weapon types in general, not just for crafting. I felt like the weapons were very samey and honestly quite similar to the first Dead Island game. You had the classics, guns, machetes, katanas, hammers, but I never felt like there was anything really unique about the game in specific. Don't get me wrong, there are a few unique weapons, but I don't think that there was enough of a variety for me to be really bothered. I did feel like a lot of the time I was looking around for stat improvements. So I definitely think that in Dead Island 3, one thing I want heavily expanded upon is the weapon variety and selection. But I think the next place is actually where Dead Island 2 really fell flat in its face for me, and that is the zombie types. Now, hold on before you all get angry. A lot of the zombie types we have in Dead Island 2 are awesome, and I love them. They're just not all that unique. A couple are. I forgot the name of it, but the zombie that shoots like these weird spikes at you and has like a hole in its chest is really cool. I liked that enemy. But then you've just got typical bloaters and screamers and infecteds and walkers, and I can't help but just feel it's really generic. Again, it's not that they're bad, they do the job, they're serviceable, but I felt like the zombies really need to be spiced up a little bit. I'm not asking for anything crazy, but just new ways to have combat engagements. And again, there are plenty of cool zombies that do spice up the gameplay in Dead Island 2, I just feel like they again borrow a lot from the first Dead Island game. But also on top of that, I just don't think there's enough of a variety in general, so I want to see it expanded upon pretty heavily. But the next one, by far, is the biggest request I have for Dead Island 3. Can we actually have it on a dead island instead of LA or a city? Put me back on an island. That was what to me made the first Dead Island so unique. And hell, even Riptide I felt had a really unique setting because it was again on an island. I think there was something really nice about the first game's setting. It was luxurious, it was really nice, it was tropical almost. And I think it genuinely made the setting of a zombie game pretty unique. I don't know many zombie games they set at the beach. And to be honest, it's something I really missed in Dead Island 2. Now, I have to say, I love Dead Island 2's map. I love the split sections. I've always been a big fan of splitting open worlds like that. I know a lot of people don't agree with that, but I think that when you split open worlds into select sections, you get a lot of variety condensed and you can pack more in. That being said, in Dead Island 2, I think they could have done with being a tad bit bigger. But I definitely want to see us return to the island. I definitely preferred the way the maps layout were in the first Dead Island game too, where you had 3 massive set pieces, massive environments to explore, opposed to like Dead Island 2, where you've got like 12 slightly smaller ones. But mainly, I want to go back to an island. I want the environment back. Another thing I really want too is some better post-launch support. Now, I've got to say, Dead Island 2's post-launch wasn't terrible, but I felt they could have done so much more considering how many people got and enjoyed the game. DLCs took way too long to come out. I'm just going to say it. I'm not a big fan of devs holding back content just to release it in DLC formats. Of course, I do prefer them actually releasing a full game and then making DLC later. But I think the wait between the launch of Dead Island and then the extra content for Dead Island was just a bit too long for fans to get on board with. I don't think many stuck around for that due to the nature of the game perhaps. It's not the longest game in the world. And I think that really could have been offset by a few updates that kind of spruced up the gameplay and added some more gameplay mechanics. I see no issue with them adding community events, which they actually, to be fair, did at times with the whole pros thing, but I've never used it. But I think that adding community events and, certain things to the game that are maybe temporary could have been really cool. I remember suggesting this a while back and it never happened, but I'm a big fan of, timed seasonal events. I think it's a reason for people to get on and play. And I'm not saying every game has to go the live service route, but just a couple things to keep people held over and busy whilst you're waiting for the next big launch of either a game or more DLC content, I think that's the best way to go for it, and I would love to see the next game follow a lot more in the footsteps of that, opposed to giving us this big dry period where we're just waiting for the next bit of content. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with launching a game and just going, hey, there's the game, enjoy it. Mafia recently just did that, and I love it for that. But I do have to say, I think the dry period for Dead Island was a bit longer than I've liked. And the final request I have is perhaps the most annoying pet peeve I have about Dead Island 2, and that is the coherency of the story. I still, having played the game maybe 5 times, have no idea what happens in the story. I've played it so many times, it's so hard to follow and understand the ending, and the whole way the game is trying to portray the story is really confusing and convoluted to me. I'm not saying make it casual orientated, but compared to the first game, it was just night and day hard to follow. Now, I do think the second game has a better story, because Dead Island 1's story was, well, it was Dead Island 1's story, wasn't it? But that being said, it was ridiculously supernatural, which I actually liked, but also really hard to follow the plot of. I found it very confusing. Now, I feel like the DLCs did a slightly better job of explaining the stories to me. I think there was actually an improvement there. I followed the DLC stories pretty well, and I was a fan of those. But the main story, I don't know what it is, but I just felt it was very hard to keep track of it at times. So for me, I would love them to just make the story a bit easier to understand. And again, I'm not asking them to water it down, keep it as crazy and wacky as you want, absolutely. I'd rather it be harder to understand than really watered down and shallow. But I think you can always make the story more approachable to the player, and it won't come at too much of a cost. And in fact, it being more approachable to the player ends up meaning more people can appreciate that story. I mean, I don't think the story was bad by any means, but I felt like I was just doing stuff to do stuff. I was playing the campaign to go around killing zombies, not really to get invested in a deep narrative. And I don't think Dead Island needs that, but personally, that's something I think about a lot when I think about this game, and just kind of how awkward the story in the second game was. And then, get ready for a bonus point here. I want a more sad and dark narrative in the next game. There was definitely a couple minor sad and dark elements of Dead Island 2, especially when you're doing the Lost and Founds. That was where most of them kind of stayed. But for the main campaign, it was this tongue-in-cheek, goofy thrill ride where there was cracking jokes every 5 minutes, and nothing ever felt as bleak and horrible as it should have. Now, ironically, this was a complaint we had about the very first game, literally like 15 years ago. Its marketing portrayed it as this really somber, dark, sad game, and it ended up not being. Now, luckily, Dead Island's 2 market was pretty on the nose. We knew we were going to be getting this more goofy style of game, but I actually prefer having a slightly somber undertone at times. It doesn't have to always be like that. You can have a really goofy overtone for the game, but at times you do have to remind the player that this is a zombie apocalypse. People are dying here. There is a genuine weight to what's happening in the game. And to me, it makes me care more about the game in general and what's happening. It makes me feel for the characters within the story. I guess I'm just saying, I wish I cared a bit more about the story, not only with how coherent it was, but also just with the general tone. I think it was really off base, and I ended up just finding myself laughing through the story instead of really paying attention and getting invested in it. And again, maybe Dead Island 2 just wasn't that sort of game, and maybe Dead Island isn't that sort of franchise, but I think it could be with enough effort. Anyways though, that's all for this video. Let me know what you want to see in Dead Island 3. I'm pretty excited for it. I think it'll be a pretty cool game, hopefully. And I'll see you in the next video, guys. Take care.